Let me tell you a quick story about how to start a podcast on Spotify. And so, in the last 3 years since COVID, or when COVID hit, and after COVID, Spotify has actually invested a lot of cash in the podcast space. And so, right now, they are number two after Apple. So, let me just quickly give you the overview here. When you think about Spotify, first of all, you were thinking before about a huge platform for streaming music, right? But in 2020, around COVID, they actually invested a lot. And right now, they actually have a 32% market share on all the podcasts in the whole world. And that's after Apple. So Apple Podcasts currently has about 38%, and Spotify owns about 32%. That's huge. So when you think about Spotify and podcasting, there is a huge market there. If you're trying to increase your audience, you want to increase your listenership, you're trying to really make your podcast a success, you definitely need to list your podcast on Spotify. But one thing I need to say here is that you need to understand there are strict instructions that you need to follow if you want to list your podcast on Spotify and keep it there. One thing I want to say also is that it's really important to understand that Spotify is not as it's not as strict as Apple, but it's still strict anyway. But you definitely want to be listed on those two platforms. I don't care how successful you are. I don't care how novice you are or how experienced you are. If you're not on Apple Podcasts and if you're not on Spotify, you are just losing big time. I'm not even just talking about your audience. I'm also talking about your monetization strategies. Because if you have a podcast, at some point you got to think about monetization if you haven't already, because that's what's going to make your podcast successful, but also sustainable, because you need to actually reinvest. You need to get cash to reinvest in the business. Okay, so this is really important. Now, one thing I need to say before giving you the step-by-steps, please make sure that you have the right RSS feed. So your show, your podcast should have the same RSS feed no matter what, and please keep it. By the way, boss, welcome back to the show. It's really a pleasure to have you here. Make yourself comfortable, and thank you so much for joining us. We're going to have a very wonderful show about how to start a podcast on Spotify. All right, so here are the steps I really want you to follow if you want to start a podcast on Spotify. Most podcast directories follow a similar process, and Spotify is not very different. Okay, the basic process is signing up for an account, submitting your RSS feed to the service, then waiting for their approval. So to help you understand how to start a podcast on Spotify and navigate the Spotify podcast submission process, we have a checklist of requirements your podcast must meet before submission. Then follow along. That we have about 7 steps. So the very first step I want you to follow right now is to verify your podcast. You need to verify that your podcast meets Spotify's requirements. So when we talk, so here are the requirements. So MP3 must be ISO IEC 11172-3, MPEG-1 Part 3, MP3. So those are the type of audio they want, and you need to have byte rates between 96 and 320 kbps. Those elements are really important. We're going to put this on the screen so you have a clear idea what I'm talking about. But you need to have this specific criteria. The cover art must be a square ratio 1:1 and be in PNG, JPEG, or TIFF format at the highest resolution possible. If your cover art is doesn't have a high resolution, you risk having your podcast being rejected. We've had clients who had their podcast submission rejected because of the cover art. Cover art is kind of similar to a thumbnail on YouTube. Okay, the RSS feed must have a title, cover art image, and relevant details for at least one episode. And episode titles and other consumer-facing fields should not exceed 20 characters. So you need to avoid you want to avoid truncation, really. So you don't want to have truncation within Spotify's platform. So 20 characters. Special characters must be HTML coded within the podcast title and descriptions. For example, news and politics should be written as news and politics. By the way, Spotify does not allow for other HTML tags like bold. These tags will be removed for your descriptions, okay, before publication. and the episode length cannot exceed 200 megabytes. 200 megabytes is about 83 minutes, 1 hour and 23 minutes at the 320 kbps, or over 200 minutes at 128 kbps. This is really important. Those could be specs, like technical specs, but they are really important. Boss, I want to quickly remind you of today's topic. I'm talking to you today about how to start a podcast on Spotify. So the first thing you have to do is to verify that your podcast meets Spotify's requirements. Number 2, you need to create a Spotify account. So when we talk about creating a Spotify account, basically you need to upload, upload a podcast on Spotify, you need to visit Spotify for podcasters, not just the regular Spotify. There is a platform specifically for podcasters. So you have to visit that. You have to visit that platform, and you need to log into your account. If you don't have an account already, you need to create one before you can move forward with the Spotify podcast submission process. Now, this is very simple. The way to do this is you can continue with Google, with Facebook, or with Apple. Like if you already have an account with those platforms, that is if you don't want to create anything new on Spotify. Okay. So that's the second thing. The second thing is you need to create a Spotify account, and please go to your email address, and you want to whitelist the email you got from Spotify so that subsequent emails don't go into junk mail, right? It's all about just making sure that you add Spotify to your safe list. Step number 3, you need to agree to the terms and conditions. Now, it's important to understand that, a lot of folks, when they hear things like terms and conditions, they just go over it. They don't even read it. But with the Spotify, if you want to start a podcast, remember, you're having a business relationship with Spotify. So uploading your podcast on Spotify is a business relationship. So you have to treat the agreement, like agree to the terms and conditions, as a contract. So read it. You want to read it because there are some important elements around, for example, around IP infringement, intellectual property. You have things that are banned, things that are prohibited. You really want to familiarize yourself with the terms and conditions. Okay, so when people talk about fine prints, fine prints, whatever, I'm not going to read it. I'm just going to sign. If you sign without reading it, you actually risk being surprised, because Spotify, when they actually see a violation on your podcast, they just suspend your account, and that's it. You can't just, there's no customer service to call and sort of complain. All right, so be very careful here. The next thing you want to do here is to enter your RSS feed link. Okay. So basically you need to give the platform your RSS link. You want to head over to your podcast hosting service and find your RSS feed link. Then add the link to Spotify and hit next. If you enter your RSS feed link incorrectly, you will receive an error message prompting you to re-enter the correct link. And so let's first talk about RSS feed. What is it? Well, this is basically a URL that websites and podcast listening platforms use to distribute frequently updated information. And the podcast directories monitor the feed consistently and display new information as it's added to the feed. If you didn't use an RSS feed, you would have to manually update each platform every time you create a new episode. Think about it. That's just crazy, right? So an RSS feed for a podcast is a bit different than one used by a website. To function correctly, a podcast RSS feed needs additional information like a title, description, artwork, category, language, and explicit rating, whereas an RSS feed for another source wouldn't require these fields. So the standard podcast RSS feed format we all use today, was basically developed by Apple Podcasts back in the days. But we're still using it today. Okay, so that's how powerful the whole thing is. And so you want to have the right information. And one thing I also need to say is that you need to understand your RSS feed is actually a reflection of several things. As I just said a few minutes ago, it's a reflection of your title, your description, your artwork, your category, your language, and the explicit rating of that podcast. So please take care of the quality of the underlying data. Take care of the quality of the title that you have, the description you have, the artwork you have, the category you have, the language you have. And also, because all of these things, once you actually submit the RSS feed to Spotify, they will start disseminating, they'll start spreading, they'll start distributing your podcast to their listeners. And you don't want you don't want potential listeners to have a very bad impression, like a very, very bad first impression of your brand. By the way, boss, I want to quickly remind you of today's topic. We're having a conversation about how to start a podcast on Spotify. The next thing you want to do here is to verify you own the podcast. Now, this you might be surprised. Like, I own the podcast. Why should I even verify this at all? I mean, are they sort of joking here? It's important to understand that Spotify wants to verify that you own the podcast content you are submitting. You need to understand that Spotify is dealing with copyrights, and the company wants to make sure there are no violations, there are no infringements cases here. So Spotify will send an 8-digit code to the email address associated with the RSS feed. This email address is likely to be the one that you use to sign up for your podcast hosting service. So what you want to do is you want to find the verification email in your inbox, then enter the unique code on Spotify. And just remember that you have an hour to retrieve the code to verify your podcast. And if you miss the window, you can always send yourself another unique 8-digit code. And what will happen here is that after verifying that you own the podcast, you can hit next. I need to say one thing here. Throughout your career, like throughout your tenure, if you will, as a podcaster on Spotify, you will constantly deal with IP, intellectual property. This is just the beginning. Whenever you post on Spotify, is going to be verified anyway. Okay, things like songs, things like soundtracks, things like images, things like whatever, cover art, whatever you use on Spotify is going to be double checked and triple checked and quadruple checked. Spotify has a series of checks, a series of capabilities, a series of tools on the platform to verify that you actually own the content you are distributing. For Spotify, it's just those content platforms have to do this so that they actually can stay away from lawsuits. Okay, so if you are on Spotify, and this is the same thing if you are on Apple Podcast, make sure that you abide by the laws, by the regulations in terms of copyright, so that you can actually be in good terms with the platform. Another thing I have to say also is that you want to make sure that you are constantly taking care of other aspects of the game. So this is really important, especially if you are in a niche that is subject to copyright infringement. Let's say you have a podcast around celebrities, or you have a podcast around news events, you have a podcast around sports event. You are going to use footage from third party sources. Make sure that you own the rights of that footage, or you have received authorization to use that footage. Very important. The next thing you need to do after verifying that you own the podcast, you need to enter details about your podcast. Okay, when we talk about enter details here, we're talking about a lot of stuff. You might be thinking, well, those are just details. No, those details actually play 3 important roles. I'll talk about the 3 important roles later on. But when you submit a podcast to Spotify, you need to enter a few details about your podcast, including in which country your podcast is made, the primary language, your podcast hosting provider's name, and the podcast primary category. And one thing I want to say here is that after choosing a primary category, you'll then be able to elect 3 subcategories. And Spotify also allows you to choose 2 more overall categories with their own subcategories. And if your podcast spans a wide range of topics, it's worth adding additional category fields. This way, your show will appear in more relevant places as Spotify users use the platform to discover new podcasts. After completing each field, you want to hit next. But before I actually talk about what happens next, I want to go back to what I said about the 3 important elements that you need to do that you can actually avail yourself of if you put the right details about your podcast. Number 1, you have SEO. You need to understand Google is constantly crawling the internet to have information about podcasts. If you have the right information, the right tags, the right metadata, you're actually providing the data, you're providing content, you're providing information, you're providing intel. You are providing information to Google and Bing and Yahoo, for that matter, to sort of try to categorize and serve your podcast to people who are searching stuff about your niche. That's number one, SEO. Number two, if you have the right details about your podcast, you are basically enabling podcasts within its own platform. You're enabling Spotify within its own platform to sort of serve your podcast to people who are searching for similar content. Because remember, Spotify itself, the platform itself, is a search engine. The third way that is really important to have the right sort of details is that you are able to cross-feed your data onto other social media. So basically, nowadays people are searching for stuff on Facebook, and Facebook is linking them to outside Facebook. Or people are searching for stuff on YouTube, and YouTube is showing them stuff that is not on YouTube. So you have those sometimes. So if you are able to properly reference your content, you can really benefit from cross-platform categorization. So when you hit next, the next and final thing you need to do is to review and submit your podcast. So basically, when we talk about actually, you want to hit everything. You want to actually review everything. When I'm talking about hitting everything, you want to review things like, the category, the RSS feed, very important. You need to make sure that you have, your art cover is correct. Your description is correct. And you have to, and once you're sure everything looks okay, hit submit. And what happens here is that after you hit submit, Spotify has officially received your podcast. It typically takes a few hours for the team to review the information and set your podcast listing live. And your show will show up in the platform shortly thereafter. One thing I need to say here is that there is something that also happens. What will happen here is that once you submit your podcast to Spotify, what you want to do here is that you constantly want to update your own Spotify profile. Because what will happen is that once your podcast is live, people will start checking you out. People will check your profile out. You need to understand when people are searching for a podcast on Spotify, when they see the art, first of all, they see three things. Number one, they see the art cover. Okay, when they see the cover art or the art cover, we call it cover art or art cover. Basically, if they see your podcast art, they will actually first see that, and then they will read the description of the podcast. And if they're interested, then they will click on your podcast or they can download the podcast to listen to it. So this is the three things I want you to really pay attention to. That's why after you hit submit, you have to go back to your profile and update everything. You want to have the right kind of information. If there is if there are links that you want to actually direct traffic to, you want to put those links on your profile. It's really important. You want to have the right description. You want to have the right details about your podcast, so that you just consider your description as a branding strategy, as a branding process, whereby you are familiarizing new listeners to your podcast. Thank you so much for your attention. I really appreciate it. In today's conversation, I was just talking to you about how to start a podcast on Spotify. I give you the overview, and then I give you the steps. So verify your podcast meets Spotify's requirements. Number 2, create a Spotify account. Number 3, agree to the terms and conditions. Number 4, enter your RSS feed link. Number 5, verify you own the podcast. Number 6, enter the details about your podcast. Number 7, review and submit your podcast. Thank you so much for your attention. I really appreciate it. God bless you. I'll talk to you another time, but until then, remember, stay marvelous.